The M1 Garand clicked empty on what should have been the first volley of the 21-gun salute. In the silence that followed, Captain Bradley Simmons turned on the young private, holding the malfunctioning rifle with a fury that made the November air feel colder. "What is wrong with you, Private?" His voice carried across the Memorial Plaza, cutting through the respectful silence of 200 gathered mourners. "You had one job, and you cannot even manage that." Private First Class Amy Chun stood frozen, her face burning red beneath her dress cap. The rifle hung useless in her hands, its bolt locked back on a jam that should not have happened. She had checked this weapon 3 times. She had done everything right. But none of that mattered now as her commander's contempt washed over her in front of the entire town. At the edge of the crowd, near the tree line where the memorial park met the woods beyond, an old man watched. He stood apart from the other spectators, close enough to hear the names being read, but far enough that no one would notice him. This was where he always stood. This was where he belonged. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories about courage, sacrifice, and the hidden heroes among us speak to you, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the ones who served. Now, let us continue. Vernon Elias Cobb had walked 4 miles through the November morning to reach this spot. His boots, held together with hope and the last of a roll of duct tape, had carried him along the same path he walked every Veterans Day and every Memorial Day. He came to hear the names. He came to remember. He never came to be seen. His coat hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful, faded Army surplus green-gray that matched the overcast sky. His white beard was trimmed short with a precision that seemed out of place given his circumstances. And his eyes, pale blue and alert, watched the confrontation unfolding at the honor guard formation with an expression that shifted from stillness to something else entirely. The captain was still berating the private. The words cruel, public, designed to wound, unacceptable, embarrassing, a disgrace to the uniform. Each accusation landed like a blow while the young woman stood at attention, taking it because that was what she had been trained to do, taking it because she had no choice. In the front row of folding chairs, a retired Marine Major General named Thomas Reese shifted uncomfortably. He had come home to this small town to deliver the keynote address, to honor the fallen from this community who had given everything. He had not come to watch a young reservist be humiliated over a mechanical failure. His jaw tightened, but protocol kept him seated. This was not his command. The crowd grew restless. Families of the fallen exchanged uneasy glances. The high school band members looked at their shoes. The VFW Honor Guard, old men in worn caps who had seen real war, watched Captain Simmons with expressions of barely concealed disgust. Vernon's hands, weathered and scarred, hung at his sides. His right index finger extended along an invisible trigger guard, a habit so old he no longer noticed it. He had not intended to move. He had not intended to do anything but watch and remember and then walk back to the woods where he lived. But something about the way that young private stood there, absorbing punishment she did not deserve, pulled at something deep in his chest. The rifle. He knew that rifle. M1 Garand, 30 caliber, the same weapon that had won a world war. He knew exactly what was wrong with it, just from the angle of the bolt and the way the private's thumb had slipped during the loading. A feeding issue, common with these older ceremonial pieces, fixable in 30 seconds by anyone who knew what they were doing. Captain Simmons demanded the private hand over the weapon. His voice had not lowered. If anything, it had grown louder, more theatrical, as if he wanted everyone present to witness his authority. "This ceremony is ruined," he announced. "Because of your incompetence, these families will not receive the salute their loved ones deserve." Vernon took a step forward, then another. His limp was barely noticeable now, the old shrapnel wound in his hip loosened by the morning's walk. He moved through the outer edge of the crowd, and people parted without quite knowing why. There was something in the way he carried himself, something that did not match the worn coat and the white beard and the boots held together with tape. General Reese noticed the movement. His eyes narrowed as they tracked the homeless man approaching the formation. There was something familiar in that walk, something that triggered memories he could not quite place. Vernon stopped 10 feet from Captain Simmons. The captain had not noticed him yet, too focused on his public dismantling of the private to register the approach. But Private Chin saw him. Her eyes widened slightly, confused, as this ragged figure emerged from the periphery. Vernon cleared his throat. His voice came out rough from disuse, barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, sir." Captain Simmons turned. His eyes swept over the worn coat, the white beard, the boots that should have fallen apart miles ago, and his lip curled with something that looked like disgust, mixed with opportunity. Here was someone even lower than the private he had been berating. Here was someone he could dismiss without consequence. "Sir, this is a closed ceremony." Simmons did not bother to hide his contempt. "Whatever you are looking for, you will not find it here." Vernon did not react to the tone. His eyes remained fixed on the jammed rifle in Private Chin's hands. "I might be able to help with that, Garand," he said quietly. "It is a feeding issue, common with the older ceremonial models." Captain Simmons laughed. It was not a kind sound. "You might be able to help." He looked around at the crowd, inviting them to share in his amusement. "Did you hear that, everyone? The vagrant thinks he can help with our rifles. Tell me, did you learn gunsmithing at the shelter, or was it under the overpass?" The words hung in the cold November air. Vernon said nothing. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, index fingers still extended along that invisible trigger guard, waiting. What Captain Simmons did not know, what no one in that Memorial Plaza knew, was that those hands had held rifles in places that did not exist on any map. Those hands had made shots that were still studied at Quantico. Those hands belonged to a man whose call sign was whispered with reverence in every scout sniper platoon from Camp Pendleton to Camp Lejeune. And in exactly 8 minutes, Captain Bradley Simmons was going to understand exactly who he had just mocked in front of 200 witnesses. 6 hours earlier, Vernon had opened his eyes in the darkness before dawn. The tarp above his head was beaded with moisture, the November cold seeping through the wool blanket he had wrapped around himself like a cocoon. For a moment he lay still, listening to the woods waking around him. A cardinal called somewhere in the bare branches. A squirrel scratched across frozen leaves. The world continued on, indifferent to the old man who had made his home among the trees. He rose with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades waking in places where slowness meant death. His camp was small but ordered. A tarp stretched between 2 oaks, angled to shed rain. A fire pit ringed with stones, cold now, but ready. His pack hung from a branch, safe from animals, containing everything he owned in this world, which was not much, which was more than he deserved. Vernon pulled the chain from beneath his shirt and held the ring that hung there. Gold, scratched, worn thin on one side from 43 years on Eleanor's finger. She had made him promise to keep it when the cancer took her. She had made him promise to keep living. He had kept the ring. The other promise had been harder. 6 years. 6 years since he had watched them lower her into the ground. 6 years since he had walked away from the house they had shared, the life they had built, the future that had died with her. He had not meant to disappear. He had only meant to walk until the weight in his chest stopped crushing him. He was still walking. The morning routine unfolded with military precision. Face washed with water from the creek, cold enough to shock the sleep away. Beard trimmed with the small scissors he kept wrapped in cloth. Teeth cleaned. Clothes straightened as best they could be. He had let go of almost everything, but he had not let go of discipline. That was the one thing he could still control. He reached into his pack and withdrew the photograph. 2 faces looked back at him, frozen in a moment from another lifetime. His daughters, taken the year before Eleanor got sick. Sarah and Rebecca, laughing at something their mother had said, sunlight in their hair. They would be in their 40s now. They would have lives he knew nothing about. They had stopped looking for him years ago, or at least he assumed they had. He had made it clear he did not want to be found. Vernon touched the photograph gently, then returned it to its place. He could not look at it for long. The resemblance to their mother was too strong. The walk to the cemetery took 40 minutes. He knew the route by heart, could have walked it blind. through the woods to the old logging road, down the hill to where the pavement began, then along the shoulder until the iron gates appeared. Eternal Rest Cemetery. Eleanor Cobb, beloved wife and mother, was in the third row from the oak tree, 7 stones from the left. He had picked wildflowers along the way. Not much was blooming in November, but he had found a few hardy stems, some late asters in purple and white. He laid them against her headstone and lowered himself to the cold ground beside her. "Morning, Ellie." His voice was soft, private, meant only for her. "It is Veterans Day. You know what that means." She had always known. Every year of their marriage, she had understood why this day mattered and why it haunted him. She had held him through the nightmares. She had never asked him to explain what he could not speak aloud. She had simply been there, steady and warm and alive. "Going to the memorial today," he continued. "Same spot as always. Just to hear the names." He paused, his throat tightening. "Thought maybe this year I might stay a little longer. Get a little closer." He shook his head. "Probably not, though. You know me." He sat with her for an hour, sometimes talking, sometimes silent. He told her about the deer he had seen last week, a big buck with a 10-point rack who had walked right past his camp without fear. He told her about the book he had been reading, a water-damaged paperback he had found in a donation bin outside the library. He did not tell her about the cold that had settled into his bones or the cough that would not quite go away. She would only worry. When the sun had risen high enough to warm the air, Vernon pressed his palm flat against the cold stone. "Same time tomorrow, Ellie. Love you." The walk to the memorial took another hour. His hip ached by the time the park came into view, the old shrapnel shifting against bone with every step. He had been 23 when that piece of metal found its home in his body. He had been lying in elephant grass outside Keysand, waiting for a shot that would save 14 Marines pinned down by enemy fire. The shot had landed. The Marines had lived. The shrapnel had stayed. That was the deal he had made with the universe a long time ago. His body in exchange for their lives. He had never regretted it. The memorial plaza was already filling when he arrived. Families in dark coats, veterans in their caps and patches, the high school band assembling with their instruments. Vernon circled wide, staying in the tree lean, finding his usual spot where he could see the bronze plaques without being seen himself. The names of the fallen were etched into that metal. Names he knew, names he had trained, names that woke him in the night. Pastor James Whitfield found him there, as he always did. The old Navy corpsman turned minister had a gift for locating men who did not want to be found. He approached without fanfare, holding 2 cups of coffee from the church tent. "Morning, Vernon." Whitfield held out one of the cups. "Thought you might want something warm." Vernon looked at the offering for a long moment. The steam rose between them, carrying the smell of something that reminded him of kitchens and comfort and everything he had walked away from. "Thank you, Pastor, but I am fine." Whitfield nodded, unsurprised. "The door is always open, Vernon. Whenever you are ready." Vernon did not answer. He was not ready. He did not know if he would ever be ready. He had spent 28 years protecting others, and he had failed to protect the one person who mattered most. Eleanor had deserved better than a husband who was never home, who carried ghosts he could not name, who fell apart completely when she needed him to be strong. The ceremony began. The color guard presented the flags. A local politician spoke words that meant well but landed hollow. And then General Thomas Reese took the podium, a Marine in dress blues with ribbons that told a story of their own, and Vernon found himself leaning forward despite himself. The general spoke of sacrifice, of the weight carried by those who serve and those who wait for them at home, of the names etched in bronze and the names etched in memory. His words were simple and true, and Vernon felt something crack open in his chest. Then the honor guard stepped forward for the 21-gun salute. 7 riflemen in a perfect line, their M1 Garands gleaming in the November light. Captain Bradley Simmons barked the commands with theatrical precision. "Ready, aim." The first volley should have split the morning silence with 7 simultaneous shots. Instead, 6 rifles fired, and 1 clicked empty, its bolt locked back on a jam that echoed louder than any gunshot could have. And Vernon watched as Captain Simmons turned on the young private, holding the malfunctioning weapon with a cruelty that seemed to come as naturally as breathing. Something old stirred in Vernon's chest, something he thought he had buried with Eleanor. He was not here to interfere. He was not here to be seen. But that young woman was being torn apart for something that was not her fault, and his legs were moving before his mind could stop them. Captain Simmons stepped closer to Vernon, using his height and his pressed uniform to establish dominance over this ragged intruder. The morning sun caught the polished brass on his chest, insignia that spoke of weekend drills and annual training exercises, of a military career built on paperwork and ceremony rather than blood and sand. "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave," Simmons said, his voice pitched loud enough for the crowd to hear. "This is a sacred ceremony for Real veterans. Not a soup kitchen, not a shelter. If you want a handout, try the church across the street." Vernon remained still. His eyes had not moved from the jammed rifle in Private Chin's trembling hands. The young woman looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground, her face still burning from the public humiliation she had already endured. Vernon remembered that feeling. He remembered being young and making mistakes in front of men who had every right to tear him apart. The difference was that those men had torn him apart in private, had rebuilt him stronger, had never sacrificed his dignity for their own satisfaction. "Sir," Vernon said quietly, his voice carrying no challenge, "I am not looking for a handout. I am only offering to help with the rifle. It is a simple fix. 30 seconds at most." Simmons laughed, a sharp bark that echoed across the silent plaza. "You hear that, everyone? 30 seconds. He turned to play to the crowd, gesturing at Vernon with open contempt. This man who cannot even afford a coat that fits thinks he knows more about military rifles than a trained honor guard unit. In the front row, General Reese had gone very still. His eyes moved between the confrontation and something else, something in the way the homeless man held himself. There was no cowering in that posture. No submission. The old man stood like a man who had faced far worse than verbal abuse and found it wanting. Several veterans in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Old men in VFW caps who had carried rifles through jungles and deserts, who recognized something in Vernon's bearing that Captain Simmons was too blind to see. One of them, a Korean War veteran named Harold Chun, no relation to the private, muttered something under his breath that sounded like "let the man try." Captain Simmons heard it. His jaw tightened. He was losing control of this moment, and men like Simmons could not tolerate losing control. He stepped even closer to Vernon, close enough that the old man could smell the aftershave and the starch and the particular arrogance of a man who had never been truly tested. "I know your type," Simmons said, dropping his voice to something he probably thought was menacing. "You hang around veterans' events looking for sympathy. Maybe you found some old dog tags at a pawn shop. Maybe you heard some stories and learned to repeat them. But I have been in the military for 12 years, and I know a fraud when I see one." Vernon's expression did not change. If anything, it grew more still, more settled, like water finding its level. He had been called worse by better men. He had been called worse by enemies who were trying to kill him at the time. This captain, with his polished brass and his weekend warrior credentials, did not register as a threat. He barely registered at all. "With respect, sir," Vernon said, "I am not here to prove anything. I am here because that young private is being blamed for a mechanical failure that is not her fault. The operating rod spring in that Garand is worn. It is not cycling properly. She could not have known that without firing it." Simmons blinked. The technical precision of the explanation had caught him off guard, but only for a moment. His face hardened again, the mask of authority sliding back into place. "And how would you know what is wrong with that rifle? You some kind of expert on antique weapons." Vernon was quiet for a moment. Behind him, he could feel the weight of 200 stares. The families of the fallen, waiting for the ceremony to continue. The veterans, watching to see how this would play out. The general, whose gaze Vernon could feel like a physical pressure on the back of his neck. "I have some experience," Vernon said finally. "Experience." Simmons seized on the word like a weapon. "What kind of experience?" "Let me guess. You were Special Forces. Delta, maybe a Navy SEAL." He was performing now, mocking, his voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. I have heard every story in the book from men like you. Homeless veterans claiming they won the war single-handed. Stolen valor is a crime, you know, a federal offense. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Stolen valor. The worst thing you could say to a man who had actually served. Vernon felt something flicker in his chest, something old and hot that he had learned to bury a long time ago. His hands remained at his sides, steady, but his right index finger pressed harder against that invisible trigger guard. Private Chen spoke for the first time. "Sir, maybe we should just let him look at it." Her voice was small but determined. "If he can fix it, the ceremony can continue." Simmons rounded on her. "Did I ask for your opinion, Private? You're the reason we are in this situation. You do not get to make suggestions." The young woman flinched but held her ground. Vernon watched her spine straighten almost imperceptibly, watched her choose to endure rather than crumble. Good. She had steel in her. She would need it if she stayed in the service. General Reese rose from his seat. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, carrying the weight of 4 decades in uniform and the quiet authority of a man who had commanded thousands. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood, and the effect rippled across the plaza like a stone dropped in still water. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Even Captain Simmons fell silent, his back straightening instinctively at the presence of superior rank. The general walked toward the confrontation with measured steps. His dress blues were immaculate, his ribbons a constellation of service that told stories most people could not read. Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Vietnam service ribbons faded with age, but still bright with meaning. He stopped beside Vernon, close enough to study the old man's face, close enough to see the scars that webbed his hands and the particular way he held himself, weight-balanced, ready for anything, close enough to notice the chain around his neck disappearing beneath the worn collar of his coat. "Captain," the general said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made Simmons stand even straighter, "I believe we have a problem with one of the ceremonial rifles." "Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Simmons said quickly. "A malfunction. I was just handling the situation." General Reese nodded slowly, his eyes still on Vernon. "And this gentleman offered to help." "Sir, he is clearly not qualified to handle military weapons. He is a vagrant, probably intoxicated. I was about to have him removed for the safety of the ceremony." The general was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Vernon and asked a question that seemed to come from somewhere far away, somewhere decades in the past. "That rifle, you said it was an operating rod spring issue. How did you know that just from looking?" Vernon met the general's eyes. Something passed between them, recognition not yet formed but stirring. "The spring tension affects the bolt timing," Vernon said. "You can see it in the angle of the lockback. The rod is not traveling far enough forward to strip the next round cleanly. Probably been in storage too long without proper maintenance." General Reese studied him for another long moment. Then he nodded once, a decision made. "Private Chun, hand this man the rifle." Captain Simmons stepped forward, his face flushing. "Sir, I really must protest. We cannot just hand a weapon to a stranger off the street. There are protocols, regulations." The general turned to look at him, and something in that gaze made Simmons take a step back. "Captain," he said quietly, "I have been in the Marine Corps for 41 years. I have seen more combat than you have seen training exercises. And right now, I'm asking you to stand down and let this man help. Is that understood?" Simmons swallowed hard. His mouth opened, then closed. "Yes, sir," he managed finally. "Understood." Vernon waited. Private Chun looked between the general and her captain, then stepped forward and held out the jammed rifle. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but there was something like hope in her eyes now. Vernon reached for the weapon, and as his fingers closed around the stock, as decades of muscle memory began to stir, his sleeve rode up just enough to reveal the faded ink on the inside of his right wrist. Coordinates, a date, and a single word in small, precise letters. General Reese saw it. His face went pale, and the word that escaped his lips was barely a whisper, but it carried across the silent memorial like a thunderclap. Whisper. The word hung in the cold November air like a ghost-made sound. Vernon froze, his hand still on the rifle, his sleeve still pushed back to reveal the faded tattoo that had betrayed him. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in over a decade. He had not expected to ever hear it again. General Reese stood motionless, his face drained of color, his eyes fixed on the coordinates inked into Vernon's weathered skin. 16 degrees, 29 minutes north. 107 degrees, 41 minutes east. Keesan, Hill 881 south. A place that existed in history books and nightmares and the memories of men who had been young there and grown old carrying what they had seen. The general's voice came out rough, uncertain, nothing like the commanding tone he had used moments before. That call sign. Whisper. I know the call sign. Vernon said nothing. His body had locked into a stillness that was not fear, but something older, something trained into him in places where being seen meant being dead. He had spent 6 years disappearing, 6 years becoming no one. And now, in the span of a single heartbeat, all of that was unraveling. Captain Simmons looked between them, confusion replacing his earlier contempt. Sir, what is happening? What is Whisper? The general did not answer him. His attention remained fixed on Vernon, on the tattoo, on the impossible reality of what stood before him. In 1968, he said slowly, I was a second lieutenant, fresh out of Quantico. They sent me to Key Sand during the siege. 77 days of hell. Vernon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He remembered those 77 days. He remembered every single one of them. There was a sniper, the general continued, his voice carrying across the silent plaza. A Marine Scout sniper who held the high ground on Hill 881 South. The NVA had us pinned down. Mortars, rockets, human wave assaults. We were losing men every day. But that sniper, he kept us alive. He was up there alone for days at a time. No support, no relief. Just him and his rifle and a spotter who got killed in the second week. The crowd had gone absolutely still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Private Chun stood frozen with the rifle still extended, forgotten now in the gravity of what was unfolding. General Reese took a step closer to Vernon. They called him Whisper, he said, because you never heard the shot that saved your life. You just saw the enemy fall and knew that somewhere up on that hill, someone was watching over you. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. I never met him. None of us did. He was a ghost, a legend. The Marines who served at Key San, we owed him our lives. I owed him my life. Vernon closed his eyes. The memorial plaza faded away, and he was back there, back in the elephant grass and the red mud and the constant thunder of artillery. Back in the hide site he had carved into the hillside, his rifle scope fogged with humidity, his body broken down by dysentery and exhaustion and the weight of being the only thing standing between 5,000 Marines and the enemy snipers who wanted them dead. He remembered his spotter, a kid from Oklahoma named Billy Hartwell, who had been 19 years old and afraid of spiders, but not afraid of anything else. Billy had taken a round through the throat on day 11. Vernon had held him while he died, had felt the blood pulse hot against his hands, had whispered promises he knew he could not keep. And then he had gone back to the scope, because that was the job, because those Marines down in the valley were counting on him, because Billy would have wanted him to keep shooting. 143 confirmed kills in 3 tours. That was the number in his service record. That was the number they had pinned medals on him for. But Vernon did not count kills. He counted lives. He counted the Marines who had made it home because he had been watching. He counted the young men who had become old men, who had raised families and built careers and never known that their futures had been purchased one trigger pull at a time by a ghost on a hill. And he counted the ones he had failed, the ones who had died before he could find a shooter, the ones whose names were etched into walls and plaques, and the leather journal he carried against his heart. General Reese's voice pulled him back to the present. After Key San, the legend grew. They said Whisper went on to other operations. Classified things. Things that never made it into the history books. He paused, studying Vernon's face with an intensity that bordered on reverence. They said he trained an entire generation of Marine Scout snipers at Quantico. That his techniques are still taught today. That every sniper who has served in the last 40 years carries a piece of what he built. Vernon opened his eyes. The weight of the general's words pressed down on him like a physical force. He had spent so long trying to disappear, trying to become small enough that the past could not find him. But the past was here now. The past was looking at him, with tears forming in its eyes. Captain Simmons had gone pale. His mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. "Sir," he managed finally, "are you saying this man is actually a veteran?" The general turned to look at him, and there was something cold in that gaze now, something that made Simmons take another step backward. "Captain, I am saying that this man is not just a veteran. I am saying that if he is who I think he is, then you just accused one of the most decorated snipers in Marine Corps history of stolen valor. In front of 200 witnesses. On Veterans Day." The words landed like artillery shells. Simmons' face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror as the implications began to sink in. His career flashed before his eyes. His reputation. Everything he had built on the foundation of his ceremonial authority. Vernon spoke for the first time since the general had whispered his call sign. His voice was quiet, steady, carrying no anger and no satisfaction. "It does not matter who I was." He looked at Private Chun, still holding the jammed rifle, still waiting. "What matters is that young woman being blamed for something that is not her fault. May I fix the rifle now?" General Reese stared at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, something that might have been understanding. "Of course," he said softly. "Please." Vernon took the M1 Garand from Private Chin's hands, and as his fingers closed around the weapon, as muscle memory older than his grief began to take over, everyone watching saw something remarkable happen. The homeless man disappeared. Something else took his place. Something that moved with fluid precision, that handled the rifle like an extension of its own body, that radiated a quiet competence so absolute it seemed to change the very air around him. His hands flew across the action, clearing the jam, checking the spring tension, making minute adjustments that most people would not have known to look for. 30 seconds, exactly as he had promised. Vernon worked the bolt twice, feeling the smooth action cycle properly now. He nodded once, satisfied, and handed the rifle back to Private Chun. Operating rod spring was compressed unevenly, he told her, his voice gentle. "Not your fault. These older ceremonial pieces need more maintenance than they usually get. You did nothing wrong." Private Chin took the rifle with trembling hands. Her eyes were wet. "Thank you," she whispered. Vernon nodded and stepped back, ready to fade into the crowd, ready to disappear again. But General Reese's hand closed around his arm, firm but not forceful, a grip that asked rather than demanded. "Please," the general said, "do not go. Not yet. There are things that need to be said, things that are long overdue." And Vernon, who had spent 6 years running from everything and everyone, found that his legs would not carry him away. Not this time. Not from this. The crowd had begun to murmur, whispers spreading like wildfire through the gathered mourners. People craned their necks to see the homeless man who had fixed the rifle, the man the general had called Whisperer. Cell phones emerged from pockets and purses. Cameras pointed at the scene unfolding before them. Whatever this was, they knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Pastor James Whitfield stood at the edge of the crowd, the 2 cups of coffee still in his hands, grown cold now. He had known Vernon for 3 years, had seen him at the edge of every ceremony, had offered help that was always politely declined, had sensed something vast and painful beneath the surface that he had never been able to reach. Now he understood why. The man he had been trying to save did not believe he deserved saving, and the man he had been trying to save had once saved thousands. General Reese still held Vernon's arm, not restraining him but anchoring him, keeping him present in a moment he clearly wanted to escape. The general's mind was racing through decades of memory, connecting dots he had never thought to connect. The techniques he had studied as a young officer, the doctrine that had shaped his own approach to combat, the legend that had loomed over every sniper school he had ever visited. "I need to know," The general said quietly, for Vernon's ears alone. "Are you him? Are you Master Gunnery Sergeant Vernon Cobb?" Call sign whisper. The man who held Hill 881 South. Vernon was silent for a long moment. The name sounded foreign to him now, like something from a story about someone else. He had not been Master Gunnery Sergeant Cobb in 6 years. He had not been anyone at all. "I was," he said finally. "A long time ago." The general's grip tightened on his arm. "Not so long," he said. "Not long enough for what you did to stop Matching." Captain Simmons had retreated several steps, his face ashen, his carefully constructed authority crumbling around him. The other members of the honor guard stood in uncertain formation, unsure whether to continue the ceremony or bear witness to whatever was happening. Private Chin clutched the repaired rifle to her chest, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. A woman rose from the front row of folding chairs. She was in her 60s, silver-haired, dressed in black with a gold star pin gleaming on her lapel. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if she were walking through water. She carried something in her hands, a small book bound in worn leather. Margaret Holloway had come to this ceremony every year for the past 8 years. She had come to hear her son's name read aloud, to be reminded that he was not forgotten, to stand in the place where his memory was honored. Staff Sergeant David Holloway, United States Marine Corps, killed in action in Fallujah in 2006. Her only child, her whole world. She approached Vernon with eyes that held no uncertainty, only a dawning recognition that seemed to glow from somewhere deep within her. She stopped in front of him and held out the leather-bound book. "My son kept a journal during his training," she said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "He wrote about his instructors, about the things they taught him, about the man who taught him that his rifle was a responsibility, not a weapon, that every shot he took was a life saved or a life ended, and he had better know the difference." Vernon stared at the journal. He could not bring himself to reach for it. He knew what was coming. He knew whose name was written in those pages. Margaret opened the book to a marked page. She began to read aloud, her voice carrying across the silent plaza. "There's an instructor here they call Whisper. Nobody knows his real name. He has been everywhere, done everything. The other instructors treat him like a legend. He does not talk much, but when he does, you listen. Today, he told me something I will never forget. He said that being a sniper is not about killing. It is about choosing who lives. Every time you look through that scope, you are making a choice. Make sure you can live with it." Vernon's eyes had closed. He remembered David Holloway. Young, eager, talented. One of the best students he had ever trained. He remembered the day he had spoken those words, standing in the classroom at Quantico with 30 young Marines hanging on his every syllable. He remembered believing what he said. He remembered when choosing who lies had still felt like a gift instead of curse. "My son made it through 2 tours because of what you taught him," Margaret continued. "He saved lives. He made choices he could live with. And when he died protecting his squad. 11 men came home because David threw himself on a grenade." She paused, her voice breaking. "He wrote about you in his last letter home. He said he hoped he had made you proud." Vernon could not speak. His throat had closed around something sharp and jagged, something that had been lodged there for years. David Holloway, another name in the journal he carried, another face that visited him in the night. He had trained that boy. He had shaped him, and he had not been able to save him. Margaret reached out and took Vernon's hand in both of hers. Her grip was warm and strong, the grip of a mother who had learned to carry unbearable weight. "You gave my son purpose," she said. "You gave him the skills to protect others. You gave him a code to live by and die by. I have wanted to thank you for 8 years. I just never knew who you were." The crowd had gone absolutely still. Even the wind had stopped. 200 people stood witness to something sacred, something that transcended ceremony and protocol and the petty cruelties of men like Captain Simmons. General Reese released Vernon's arm and stepped back. His hand rose to his brow in a salute so crisp it might have been cut from glass. Around the plaza, other veterans followed suit. Old men in VFW caps, their bodies bent by age but their spines straightening with pride. young reservists who had never seen combat, but understood instinctively that they stood in the presence of something greater than themselves. Even Private Chun, still clutching the repaired rifle, brought her hand up in a trembling salute. Vernon stood in the center of it all, surrounded by honor he had never sought and recognition he did not believe he deserved. His eyes found Pastor Whitfield in the crowd, still holding those 2 cold cups of coffee, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a door opening that had been closed for 6 years. But before Vernon could respond, before he could accept or deflect or disappear, another voice cut through the reverent silence. A voice from the back of the crowd, high and sharp and breaking with emotion. "Dad!" Vernon turned, and the world stopped spinning. A woman was pushing through the gathered mourners, her face twisted with shock and hope and years of unanswered questions. She was in her 40s, with her mother's eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and she was staring at Vernon like she had seen a ghost. Because she had. Sarah Cobb, his eldest daughter, had driven 3 hours to attend this ceremony. Her mother-in-law lived in this town. Her mother-in-law had lost a nephew in Afghanistan and wanted company at the memorial. Sarah had agreed because she agreed to everything these days, because staying busy was easier than staying still, because stillness meant thinking about the father who had vanished 6 years ago without explanation. And now he was standing 20 feet away, surrounded by saluting veterans, looking more lost than she had ever seen him. "Dad," she said again, her voice cracking. "Is that really you?" Vernon could not move. His body, which had carried him through jungles and deserts and the worst places human beings had ever devised to kill each other, had turned to stone. His daughter stood 20 feet away, and the distance between them might as well have been the span of oceans. "Sarah!" Her name came out broken, barely a whisper, the first time he had spoken it aloud in 6 years. She pushed through the last of the crowd, her movements frantic, desperate, as if she feared he might vanish again if she did not reach him quickly enough. Behind her, another figure emerged, younger, with the same determined set to her jaw. Rebecca, his baby girl, who was not a baby anymore, who was a grown woman with tears streaming down her face. Vernon's knees threatened to buckle. He had watched them from a distance. He had tracked their lives through library computers and overheard conversations and the occasional glimpse from across a parking lot. He knew Sarah had gotten married. He knew Rebecca had finished law school. He knew they had built lives without him, lives he had no right to interrupt, lives he had removed himself from because he believed they were better off without a broken man dragging them down. But he had never expected this. He had never prepared for the moment when the distance would collapse, when the walls he had built would crumble, when his daughters would stand before him with 6 years of questions burning in their eyes. Sarah reached him first. She stopped just short of touching him, her hands hovering in the air between them as if she did not know whether to embrace him or strike him. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her whole body trembling with the force of emotions she could not contain. 6 years, she said, her voice shaking. 6 years, Dad. We thought you were dead. We searched everywhere. We filed missing persons reports. We hired investigators. Mom's funeral, and you just disappeared. You left a note that said nothing. You abandoned us when we needed you most. Vernon flinched at each word, each accusation landing with the precision of a well-aimed round. She was right. She was absolutely right. He had done all of those things and worse. He had convinced himself it was for their protection, that his presence would only cause more pain, that they deserved to grieve their mother without watching their father fall apart. But standing here now, seeing the anguish carved into his daughter's face, he understood how wrong he had been, how selfish, how utterly blind. "I am sorry," he said, and the words were so inadequate they almost choked him. "Sarah, I am so sorry." Rebecca reached them, her eyes red and swollen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had always been the quieter one, the observer, the one who processed everything internally before speaking. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. "We needed you," she said. "After Mom died, we needed our father. And you just left, like we did not matter, like we were not enough to stay for." The words hit Vernon harder than any bullet ever had. Not enough to stay for. Is that what they had believed? Is that the story they had told themselves to make sense of his abandonment? The thought made him physically ill. Around them, the crowd had pulled back, creating a circle of space for this reunion that was equal parts joy and devastation. General Reese stood at a respectful distance, his face etched with compassion. Margaret Holloway clutched her son's journal to her chest, tears flowing freely. Even Captain Simmons had retreated to the far edge of the plaza, his earlier arrogance replaced by the expression of a man watching something he did not deserve to witness. Vernon reached up and pulled the chain from beneath his shirt. The gold ring caught the November sunlight, spinning slowly, worn thin on one side from decades on Eleanor's finger. "I never stopped loving you," he said, his voice raw. "Either of you. I left because I could not look at you without seeing her. I left because every time you smiled, I saw your mother's smile. And it broke me." He paused, struggling to find words for feelings he had never spoken aloud. "I thought if I stayed, my brokenness would infect you. I thought you deserved better than watching your father drown in grief. I thought I was protecting you." Sarah's face crumpled. "Protecting us." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Dad, we were drowning too. We needed to drown together. We needed to hold on to each other. That is what families do. They do not run away. They stay and fight." Vernon nodded slowly. He had no defense, no justification, only the truth of a man who had faced death 1,000 times without flinching, but had crumbled completely under the weight of loss. "I know," he said. "I know that now. I knew it then, somewhere deep down. But the knowing did not stop the running. Nothing stopped the running until I had nowhere left to run." Rebecca stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her hand reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that 6 years of hard living had carved into his skin. She touched the white beard, the weathered cheeks, the eyes that had seen too much and hidden too long. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice cracking. "All this time. Where did you go?" Vernon gestured vaguely toward the tree line at the edge of the park. "Out there," he said, "in the woods, moving from place to place, trying to disappear." Sarah looked toward the trees, then back at her father. Her expression shifted, the anger giving way to something else, something that looked like horror as she truly absorbed what he was telling her. "You have been homeless," she said, "for 6 years. Our father, a decorated Marine, living in the woods like an animal." Vernon shook his head. "Not like an animal, like a man who did not deserve a home, like a man paying penance for sins he could never atone for." "What sins?" Rebecca demanded. "What could you possibly have done that required 6 years of punishment?" Vernon was quiet for a long moment. The crowd waited. His daughters waited. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. "I survived," he said finally. "That was my sin. I survived when so many others did not. I survived Vietnam when Billy Hartwell bled out in my arms. I survived 30 years of operations that killed better men than me. And then your mother got sick, and I cannot save her either. I cannot do anything but watch her slip away. After a lifetime of saving strangers, I could not save the woman I loved." The words hung in the air, heavy with a grief that had been building for decades. Sarah and Rebecca stared at their father, seeing him perhaps for the first time. Not as the strong, silent man who had raised them, not as the absent father who had abandoned them, but as a human being, broken and flawed, and drowning in a pain he had never learned to share. Sarah moved first. She closed the remaining distance between them and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into an embrace so fierce it seemed to defy the years of separation. A moment later, Rebecca joined them, her arms encircling both her father and her sister. Vernon stood rigid for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, his body unsure how to accept comfort after so long without it. Then something inside him cracked open, something that had been sealed shut since the day he walked away from his family. He wept. For the first time in 6 years, Vernon Cobb wept. Great racking sobs that shook his entire frame, that poured out of him like water from a broken dam. He clutched his daughters as if they were the only solid things in a world that had been spinning out of control for so long he had forgotten what stillness felt like. The crowd watched in silence. Veterans wiped their eyes. Families held each other closer. And somewhere in the back of the plaza, a local news reporter named Dana Morrison lowered her phone, realizing that some moments were too sacred to broadcast. The embrace lasted for what felt like hours and ended far too soon. When Vernon finally pulled back, his face was wet with tears he had not known he was still capable of crying. His daughters held onto his arms, as if afraid he might bolt again, might disappear into the tree-line, and leave them with nothing but questions for another 6 years. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at her father, really looked at him, taking in the worn coat and the weathered skin and the boots held together with tape and determination. Her expression cycled through grief and anger and something that might have been the first fragile stirrings of forgiveness. "You look terrible," she said, and despite everything, there was a hint of her mother's dry humor in the words. Vernon almost smiled. Imagine Ido. Rebecca had not released his arm. Her grip was tight, anchoring, as if she could physically prevent him from leaving through sheer force of will. "We have so many questions," she said. "So much we need to understand. But right now, I just need to know one thing." Vernon met her eyes. "Anything. Are you going to run again?" She held his gaze, searching for something in those pale blue depths. "Because if you are, tell us now. Do not make us go through losing you twice." The question cut through everything else, straight to the core of the matter. Vernon stood in the center of the Memorial Plaza, surrounded by witnesses and veterans and the weight of his own history. He thought about the woods waiting at the edge of the park, the camp he had built, the solitude that had become his prison and his sanctuary. He thought about how easy it would be to slip away, to disappear into the familiar darkness of isolation. But he also thought about Eleanor, about the promise he had made at her graveside that very morning, about the wildflowers he had laid against her headstone and the words he had whispered about maybe staying a little longer this time. She would not want this. She had never wanted this. Eleanor had spent their entire marriage trying to pull him back from the edge, trying to show him that he deserved the same love he gave so freely to others. And he had repaid her by abandoning their children in the depths of their shared grief. "No," Vernon said, and his voice was steady for the first time since his daughters had appeared. "No more running. I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to come back from where I have been, but I will not run again. I promise you that." Rebecca's grip on his arm loosened slightly, not releasing but relaxing. Sarah let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 6 years. General Reese stepped forward, his presence a reminder that they were not alone in this moment. He had maintained a respectful distance during the reunion, but now he approached with purpose. His eyes moved between Vernon and his daughters, understanding dawning. "You have family," he said to Vernon. "All this time, you had family looking for you." Vernon nodded slowly. "I convinced myself they were better off without me." The general shook his head. "Sergeant Major, I have known a lot of Marines who suffered from that particular delusion. Good men who believed the lie that they were burdens instead of blessings." He paused, his voice softening. "Your daughters clearly do not share that assessment." Sarah turned to face the general, curiosity breaking through the emotional turmoil. "Who are you? How do you know my father?" General Reese straightened slightly, habit taking over. "Major General Thomas Reese, United States Marine Corps, retired. I served in Vietnam during the same period as your father, and I have spent 40 years studying the techniques he developed, the doctrine he created, the legacy he built." "Legacy?" Sarah repeated the word as if it were foreign. She looked at Vernon. What was he talking about? What legacy? Vernon shifted uncomfortably. "It does not matter. Ancient history." The general shook his head firmly. "With respect, Sergeant Major, it matters a great deal. Your daughters deserve to know who their father really is. Not just the man who left, but the man who served." He turned to Sarah and Rebecca. "Your father is one of the most decorated snipers in Marine Corps history. His techniques are still taught at every scout sniper school in the military. He trained an entire generation of warriors. He saved more lives than any official count could capture." Sarah stared at the general, then at her father. Vernon could see her recalibrating everything she thought she knew about him. He had never talked about his service, not in any real way. He had kept that part of himself locked away, separate from the husband and father his family knew. "Dad," Rebecca said slowly, "is that true?" Vernon sighed. "Some of it. The general is being generous." General Reese made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Generous? Sergeant Major, I have read your classified file. I have studied operations you conducted that are still too sensitive to discuss in public. Generous does not begin to cover what this country owes you." From across the plaza, Captain Simmons watched this exchange with growing horror. Every word the general spoke added another layer to the magnitude of his mistake. He had accused this man of stolen valor. He had mocked him in front of 200 people. He had tried to have him removed from a ceremony honoring veterans. His career was over. He knew it with a certainty that settled into his bones like ice. The video was probably already online. The story would spread. By tomorrow, his name would be synonymous with everything wrong with how society treated its forgotten warriors. Pastor Whitfield made his way through the crowd, still carrying those 2 cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. He stopped beside the small family gathering, his presence unobtrusive but steady. "Vernon," he said gently, "I have been offering you help for 3 years. You always said no." He held out one of the cups, a gesture that had become ritual between them. "I'm going to ask one more time, and this time I am hoping you will say yes." Vernon looked at the cup, at the pastor's weathered face, at his daughters still clinging to his arms, at the general, who had saluted him like he was still somebody, at the crowd of veterans who had witnessed his humiliation and his redemption in the span of a single morning. The isolation he had wrapped around himself like a blanket suddenly felt less like protection and more like a cage. He had convinced himself that solitude was what he deserved, but deserving had nothing to do with it. His daughters were here. They had never stopped looking. They had never stopped hoping. Eleanor's voice echoed in his memory, something she had said to him years ago when the nightmares were at their worst. "You cannot save everyone, Vernon, but you can let yourself be saved." He reached out and took the cup of coffee from Pastor Whitfield's hand. The pastor smiled. "There's a place at the church, a room for veterans in transition. It is not much, but it is warm and dry, and there are people who understand what you have been through. No pressure, no paperwork, just a door that stays open." Vernon wrapped his cold fingers around the cup, feeling the distant warmth that still lingered in the ceramic. He looked at Sarah and Rebecca, at the hope blazing in their eyes. "I would like to try," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth, unfamiliar. "I do not know if I know how anymore, but I would like to try." Sarah squeezed his arm. "That is all we are asking, Dad. Just try." Behind them, the honor guard still stood in formation, waiting. The ceremony had been interrupted, derailed, transformed into something no one had anticipated. But the names of the fallen still needed to be honored. The 21-gun salute still needed to be fired. General Reese seemed to read Vernon's thoughts. He gestured toward the formation. "Sergeant Major, would you do us the honor of joining the salute? I think it would be fitting." Vernon hesitated. He looked at the rifles, at the young service members holding them, at Private Chun, who had started this whole chain of events with a jammed weapon. He thought about all the ceremonies he had watched from the edge of the crowd, never participating, never belonging. "I am not in uniform," he said quietly. "I'm not fit to stand with them." General Reese shook his head. "You are more fit than any of us." He gestured at Vernon's worn coat, his weathered face, his boots held together with hope. "This is your uniform now. The uniform of a man who kept serving even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching." Vernon turned to his daughters. Sarah nodded. Rebecca released his arm and gave him a gentle push toward the formation. "Go," she said. "We will be right here when you are done." Vernon straightened, his spine aligned with muscle memory older than his grief. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and somewhere beneath the worn coat and the white beard, the Marine emerged once more. Vernon walked toward the honor guard formation with steps that grew steadier with each stride. The crowd parted before him, veterans nodding as he passed, civilians watching with a respect they did not fully understand but felt nonetheless. Behind him, his daughter stood with Pastor Whitfield, bearing witness to a transformation that had been 6 years in the breaking. Private Chin watched him approach, her eyes wide. She still held the rifle he had repaired, the M1 Garand that had started everything. When Vernon reached the formation, she snapped to attention with a precision that spoke of genuine respect rather than mere protocol. "Sergeant Major," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It would be an honor to have you stand with us." Vernon studied her face. She was young, probably no older than 22 or 23. She had joined the reserves to serve her country on weekends while building a civilian career. She had not asked to be humiliated in front of 200 people. She had not asked to become the catalyst for a revelation that would change multiple lives. "The honor is mine, Private," Vernon said. He meant it. General Reese approached Captain Simmons, who had been standing frozen at the edge of the formation like a man awaiting execution. The captain's face had gone gray, his earlier arrogance replaced by the hollow expression of someone watching his world crumble in real time. "Captain," the general said, his voice pitched low enough that only Simmons could hear, "we're going to complete this ceremony. You're going to conduct the salute with professionalism and respect. And when it is over, you and I are going to have a conversation about leadership and the treatment of those who have served." Simmons swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." The general held his gaze for a moment longer, ensuring the message had landed. Then he turned back to the formation and the crowd beyond. His voice carried across the plaza with the authority of 4 decades in uniform. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. The ceremony will now continue." He paused, letting the silence settle. "But before we proceed, I want to take a moment to recognize someone extraordinary. A man who stepped forward today to help when he had every reason to stay hidden. A man whose service to this nation spans 3 tours in Vietnam, countless classified operations, and 28 years of shaping the warriors who protect us still." Vernon shifted uncomfortably. He had not wanted recognition. He had only wanted to fix a rifle and disappear back into the woods. But the general was not finished. Master Gunnery Sergeant Vernon Cobb, call sign Whisper, served with distinction that most of us cannot begin to comprehend. His techniques are still taught at every scout sniper school in the military. His actions saved lives that can never be fully counted. And today, after years of carrying burdens in silence, he has reunited with the family he thought he had lost forever. The crowd stirred, murmurs of understanding rippling through the gathered mourners. People looked at Vernon with new eyes, seeing not a homeless vagrant, but a warrior who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. General Reese continued, "On this Veterans Day, as we honor all who have served, let us also remember that service does not end when the uniform comes off, that the wounds of war are not always visible, and that the men and women who protected our freedom sometimes need us to protect them in return." He turned to Vernon. "Sergeant Major, would you please take your place in the formation?" Vernon nodded once, a gesture that contained decades of discipline. He moved to stand beside Private Chun, his body falling into alignment with an ease that surprised even him. His feet found their position without thought. His spine straightened. His hands settled at his sides in perfect form. The other members of the honor guard watched him with barely concealed awe. These were weekend warriors, reservists who practiced ceremony a few times a year. They had never stood beside a legend. They had never been in the presence of someone whose name was whispered in the halls of Quantico like a prayer. Captain Simmons took his position at the head of the formation. His voice, when it came, was stripped of its earlier theatrical arrogance. It was simply professional, simply correct. "Honor guard, attention." 7 rifles rose as one, including the M1 Garand that Vernon had repaired. Private Chun held it with steady hands now, her earlier trembling replaced by the confidence of someone who had been given a second chance. "Ready." Vernon did not have a rifle. He stood at attention with nothing in his hands but the memory of every weapon he had ever carried. The weight of them settled into his palms like ghosts. The M40 he had used at Key San. The Barrett he had carried in operations that would never be declassified. the training rifles he had pressed into the hands of young Marines who went on to save lives of their own. Aim. The rifles rose toward the gray November sky. Vernon's eyes fixed on the bronze plaques across the plaza, the names of the fallen etched in metal that would outlast everyone present. He thought of Billy Hartwell, of David Holloway, of every man and woman whose name was written in the journal he carried against his heart. Fire. 7 shots split the morning air in perfect unison. The sound rolled across the plaza and echoed off the surrounding hills, a thunder that spoke of sacrifice and remembrance and the debt that could never be fully repaid. Vernon flinched at the report, an involuntary response buried so deep it would never fully fade. But he held his position. He held his bearing. He stood with the honor guard as they fired the second volley, then the third. 21 shots for the fallen. 21 acknowledgments of lives given in service of something greater than themselves. 21 promises that they would not be forgotten. When the last echo faded, when the smoke had drifted away on the November wind, General Rees called out in a voice that cracked with emotion. "Present arms." The honor guard saluted as one. And then, throughout the crowd, other hands rose. Veterans in their caps and patches, some with tears streaming down weathered faces. Active duty service members who had come to honor their predecessors. Even civilians who had never worn a uniform but understood the weight of this moment. 200 people saluting a man who had spent 6 years believing he deserved nothing. Vernon held his position, his own hand raised in a salute that trembled slightly despite his best efforts. He was not saluting himself. He was saluting Billy Hartwell and David Holloway. He was saluting the thousands of names on the bronze plaques and the thousands more on walls and memorials across the country. He was saluting Eleanor, who had loved him through all of it and never once complained. In the front row, Sarah and Rebecca stood with their hands over their hearts. Their faces were wet with tears, but they were smiling. For the first time in 6 years, they were looking at their father with something other than confusion and grief. They were looking at him with pride. General Rees held the salute for a long moment, then dropped his hand. "Order arms." The formation relaxed. The crowd slowly lowered their hands. And Vernon stood among the honor guard, breathing hard, feeling something shift inside his chest. Something that had been frozen for a very long time was beginning to thaw. Private Chin turned to him, her young face earnest and open. "Sergeant Major," she said quietly, "thank you. For fixing the rifle. For standing with us. For everything." Vernon looked at her, at this young woman who had been humiliated and had chosen to endure, who had spoken up when it would have been easier to stay silent, who had handed him a rifle and set in motion a chain of events that had changed everything. "You have good instincts, Private," he said. "Do not let anyone make you doubt them." She nodded, standing a little straighter. "Yes, Sergeant Major." The ceremony was not quite over. There were still names to be read, still taps to be played, still the slow and solemn rituals that marked this day of remembrance. But something fundamental had shifted. The air felt different. The silence felt different. Vernon turned to look at his daughters, still standing at the edge of the plaza. Sarah raised her hand in a small wave. Rebecca smiled through her tears. He was not healed. He was not fixed. 6 years of isolation and grief could not be undone in a single morning. But for the first time since Eleanor died, Vernon Cobb felt something he had forgotten was possible. He felt hope. The bugler stepped forward as the last echoes of the rifle salute faded into the November sky. He was an old man, older even than Vernon, with hands that shook slightly as he raised the instrument to his lips. But when the first notes of taps floated across the memorial plaza, they were pure and clear and heartbreaking in their simplicity. Vernon stood at attention as the melody washed over him. 24 notes. That was all it took to reduce grown men to tears. 24 notes that carried the weight of every service member who had ever given their life for their country. He had heard taps played hundreds of times at funerals and ceremonies and in the quiet moments when memory demanded acknowledgement. It never got easier. It was never supposed to get easier. Day is done, gone the sun. The notes hung in the cold air like prayers. From the lake, from the hills, from the sky. All is well, safely rest. God is nigh. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was absolute. 200 people stood motionless, bound together by grief and gratitude and the solemn understanding of what this day meant. General Reese stepped forward to the podium one final time. His voice, when he spoke, was rougher than before, the emotion no longer fully contained. We will now read the names of the fallen from this community. Please remain standing as we honor their memory. A woman in civilian clothes approached the microphone. She was the town clerk, Vernon would learn later, a position she had held for 30 years. She opened a leather folder and began to read. Private First Class Michael Ambrose, United States Army. Killed in action, Korea, 1952. The name floated across the plaza. Somewhere in the crowd, an elderly woman bowed her head. A widow, perhaps, or a sister who had never stopped mourning. Sergeant William Brennan, United States Marine Corps. Killed in action, Vietnam, 1968. Vernon's breath caught. 68. Khe Sanh. He did not know the name, but he knew the year. He knew the place. He knew the cost. The names continued. Corel, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Each one a life ended too soon. Each one a family shattered. Each one a debt that could never be repaid. Staff Sergeant David Holloway, United States Marine Corps. Killed in action, Iraq, 2006. Margaret Holloway made a small sound, a gasp of grief that she had been holding for 8 years. Vernon turned to look at her. This mother who had lost her son. This woman who had thanked him for training the boy who had given everything. Their eyes met across the plaza, and something passed between them. Understanding. Shared loss. The bond of those who carry names in their hearts. The reading continued. 43 names in total, spanning 7 decades of conflict. 43 lives from this small town alone. Vernon listened to each one, memorizing them, adding them to the catalog of the fallen that he carried with him always. When the last name was read, when the clerk closed her folder and stepped back from a microphone, General Reese addressed the crowd one final time. These are the names we speak aloud, he said, but there are other names. Names that cannot be shared because the missions remain classified. Names of men and women who serve in the shadows, who gave their lives in places that will never appear on any map. He paused, his eyes finding Vernon in the formation. We honor them too, even in silence, especially in silence. Vernon understood what the general was saying. There were names he could not speak, operations he could not acknowledge, brothers and sisters in arms whose sacrifices would never be publicly recognized. They lived only in the memories of those who had served beside them, carried forward by the survivors who could not forget. The ceremony concluded with the retiring of the colors. The flag was folded with precision, each crease deliberate, each fold meaningful. When it was complete, when the triangle of stars was cradled in the arms of the color guard, the crowd began to slowly disperse. But Vernon did not move. He stood rooted in place, watching the families file past the bronze plaques, watching fingers trace names carved in metal, watching tears fall on stone that had absorbed decades of grief. Sarah and Rebecca approached him carefully, as if he were something fragile that might shatter at the wrong touch. They flanked him on either side, their presence warm against the November chill. That was beautiful, Rebecca said softly. Painful, but beautiful. Vernon nodded. He did not trust his voice. Sarah slipped her hand into his, her fingers intertwining with his weathered ones. It was a gesture from childhood, something she had not done since she was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. Dad, she said, we need to talk. About everything. About what happens next. I know, Vernon managed. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw by emotion. I know we do. General Reese approached, having completed his duties as keynote speaker. He moved with the careful respect of a man who understood he was interrupting something fragile and important. Sergeant Major, he said, I did not want to intrude on your family, but I wanted you to know that what happened here today, it matters. Not just for you, for everyone who watched. For every veteran who has ever felt forgotten or dismissed or invisible. Vernon looked at him. I did not do anything. I just fixed a rifle. The general shook his head. You did far more than that. You showed up. After everything you have been through, after years of hiding, you stepped forward when someone needed help. That is what service looks like. That is what it has always looked like. Margaret Holloway had made her way through the dispersing crowd. She still clutched her son's journal, that leather-bound testament to a young Marine's admiration for his instructor. She stopped in front of Vernon, her eyes red but her spine straight. I meant what I said earlier, she told him. My son wrote about you constantly. You were his hero. She pressed the journal into his hands before he could protest. I want you to have this. David would have wanted you to have it. Vernon stared at the journal. The leather was soft with age, the pages swollen from years of handling. Inside were the words of a dead Marine, a boy he had trained, a life he had shaped and lost. I cannot accept this, he said. This belongs with his family. Margaret smiled, an expression that held both grief and peace. You are his family, Sergeant Major. Everyone David ever served with, everyone who taught him, everyone who shaped the man he became. You're all his family. She closed his fingers around the journal. Read it sometime. See yourself through his eyes. Maybe it will help. Vernon did not know what to say. Words felt insufficient for the weight of this gift. So he simply nodded, clutching the journal to his chest alongside the leather book that held his own catalog of names. Pastor Whitfield appeared at the edge of the gathering. He had been waiting patiently, giving the family space while remaining close enough to offer support. Now he stepped forward with the quiet confidence of a man who had guided countless souls through difficult passages. Vernon, he said, whenever you are ready, the room at the church is available. No ruse, no pressure. He smiled gently. But your daughters might appreciate knowing you have somewhere warm to sleep tonight. Sarah's grip on Vernon's hand tightened. We can take you home with us, she said quickly. You do not need to stay at the church. You can come home. Vernon felt the pull of that offer like a physical force. Home, a word he had not associated with himself in 6 years. A concept he had convinced himself he no longer deserved. But he also knew himself. He knew the darkness that still lived inside him, the grief that could rise without warning, the nightmares that turned sleep into a battlefield. He could not bring that into his daughters' homes. Not yet. Not until he had learned to carry it differently. The church, he said slowly. For now, until I figure out how to be around people again. He looked at Sarah, then Rebecca, willing them to understand. I want to come home, more than anything. But I need to learn how to be someone worth coming home first. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Okay, Dad. The church for now. But we're going to visit every day. And call. And make sure you are eating actual food. Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder. We just got you back. We are not losing you again. Vernon wrapped an arm around each of them, pulling them close. You will not, he promised. Never again. Across the plaza, Captain Simmons watched this reunion with an expression of profound shame. The video of his behavior was already spreading online, shared by witnesses who had captured every cruel word. His phone had been vibrating constantly for the past 30 minutes with messages he could not bring himself to read. He had come to this ceremony as the commander of the honor guard, proud of his position and his authority. He would leave it as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when arrogance met humility and lost. The crowd had thinned considerably by the time General Reese asked Vernon to walk with him. The families had paid their respects and departed. The high school band had packed their instruments and loaded onto buses. The VFW veterans had retreated to their hall for coffee and remembrance. What remained was a quiet plaza, a handful of lingering mourners, and the weight of everything that had transpired. Sarah and Rebecca had stepped away to make phone calls, explaining to spouses and employers why they would not be returning as planned. Vernon watched them from across the plaza, these women who had grown up while he was gone, who had built lives he knew nothing about. He had so much to learn, so much time to make up for. The task felt impossible and necessary in equal measure. General Reese walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the bronze plaques that lined the memorial path. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood their weight. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. "Something I have carried for 45 years. Vernon waited. He recognized the tone, the careful approach to a wound that had never fully healed. At Keysand, the general continued. There was a day in February. We had been under siege for 3 weeks. The NVA had overrun one of our listening posts the night before. Killed everyone there. 12 Marines gone in minutes." He paused, his jaw tightening. The next morning, they started using the bodies as bait, propping them up, waiting for us to send a recovery team so they could ambush them too. Vernon remembered. He remembered watching through his scope as the enemy positioned those bodies. He remembered the cold calculation of it, the cruelty designed to multiply the killing. Command said we could not risk more men, the general said. They ordered us to leave the bodies where they were, to let the enemy have that victory. He shook his head slowly. I was a second lieutenant, barely old enough to shave, and I had to tell my men that we were abandoning our brothers. The general stopped walking. He turned to face Vernon directly, and there were tears in his eyes now, tears that had been waiting decades to fall. But someone did not follow that order, he said. Someone went out alone, in daylight, through 800 meters of enemy territory, and one by one, they started dropping. The NVA who had set the trap, the snipers waiting in the trees, the mortar team that had been zeroed in on the bodies. They just started falling. No sound, no warning, like the hand of God reaching down and erasing them from the earth. Vernon said nothing. His throat had closed around memories he had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself they were not real. By nightfall, it was safe enough to send a recovery team, the general continued. We brought our brothers home, all 12 of them, because someone up on that hill decided that no Marine gets left behind, regardless of what command said. He held Vernon's gaze. That was you, was it not? Vernon was quiet for a long moment. The coordinates tattooed on his wrist seemed to burn against his skin. 16 degrees, 29 minutes north. The exact position of his hide site that day. It was not heroic, Vernon said finally. It was rage, pure and simple. I saw what they were doing to our dead, and I could not let it stand. I was not thinking about orders or consequences. I was thinking about Billy Hartwell bleeding out of my arms 3 days earlier. I was thinking about how they would do the same thing to his body if they got the chance. The general shook his head. Call it whatever you want. Rage, instinct, divine intervention. The result was the same. 12 families got to bury their sons because of what you did that day. He reached out and gripped Vernon's shoulder. I have spent 45 years wondering who you were. 45 years wanted to say thank you. And today, I finally can. Vernon did not know how to respond. Gratitude had always made him uncomfortable. The things he had done, the lives he had taken and saved, they were not transactions to be balanced. They were simply what had needed to be done. I was just doing my job, he said. The general almost smiled. That is what heroes always say. They resumed walking, passing the plaques with their engraved names, their silent testaments to sacrifice. The November sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the plaza. What will you do now? The general asked. After today, Vernon considered the question. For 6 years, his answer would have been simple. Survive. Disappear. Wait for the end. But that answer no longer fit. The world had shifted beneath his feet, and he was still trying to find his balance. I do not know, he admitted. Pastor Whitfield offered a room at the church. My daughters want me to come home with them. He paused, looking toward the tree line at the edge of the park. Part of me still wants to walk back into those woods and pretend none of this happened. The general nodded slowly. That part will always be there. The part that wants to isolate, to retreat, to carry everything alone because that is what you have always done. He stopped and turned to face Vernon again. But you do not have to listen to it. You have earned the right to rest, to heal, to let other people carry some of the weight. Vernon thought about Eleanor. About the nights she had held him through the screaming. About the mornings she had pretended not to notice the haunted look in his eyes. She had carried so much of his weight, and he had never fully acknowledged it until she was gone. My wife used to say something similar, Vernon said quietly. She said I did not have to save the world by myself. that letting people in was not weakness. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Vernon's voice cracked slightly. She was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I repaid her by falling apart when she needed me to be strong. The general was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke with the careful precision of someone who had learned hard truths about himself. I lost my first wife to this job, he said. Not to death, to distance. I was so focused on the mission, on being the perfect Marine, that I forgot to be a husband. By the time I realized what I had done, she had already stopped waiting. He sighed heavily. We do not get to undo our mistakes, Sergeant Major. We only get to learn from them and hope that the people we love are willing to give us another chance. Vernon looked across the plaza to where Sarah and Rebecca stood, still on their phones, occasionally glancing in his direction as if to make sure he had not vanished. They were giving him another chance. After everything he had put them through, they were still here. How do I do this? Vernon asked, and his voice was stripped bare, vulnerable in a way he had not allowed himself to be in decades. How do I come back from where I have been? General Reese considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. One day at a time, he said. One conversation at a time. One meal with your daughters at a time. You do not have to figure out the rest of your life today. You just have to figure out tonight. Tonight. Vernon could manage tonight. Tonight was the church and a warm room and the promise of his daughters visiting tomorrow. Tonight was small enough to hold. Sergeant Major, the general said, reaching into his pocket. I want you to have this. He pressed something into Vernon's palm. A challenge coin, heavy and worn, bearing the insignia of the Marine Corps and the words "First to Fight" etched around the edge. This coin was given to me by a colonel at Key San, General Reese said, the day after those 12 bodies were recovered. He told me to pass it on someday to someone who embodied what the Corps was supposed to be. He closed Vernon's fingers around the coin. I have been holding on to it for 45 years, waiting for the right person. I think I finally found him. Vernon stared at the coin in his palm. The weight of it was nothing. The weight of what it represented was almost unbearable. I am not that person anymore, he said. I'm just an old man who has made too many mistakes. The general shook his head firmly. You are exactly that person. You always have been. The mistakes do not erase the service. The years in the wilderness do not undo the lives you saved. He stepped back and snapped to attention, delivering a salute so crisp it seemed to cut the air. Master Gunnery Sergeant Vernon Cobb. Call sign Whisper. It has been the honor of my life to finally meet you. Vernon's hand rose automatically, returning the salute with the precision of 50 years of muscle memory. The two men held the gesture for a long moment, two Marines bound by shared history and shared sacrifice. When they dropped their hands, Vernon found that something had shifted inside him. Not healed, not fixed, but different, lighter, as if a door had opened somewhere in his chest and let in the first breath of fresh air in years. Thank you, he said, for everything you said today, for not letting me disappear. General Reese smiled. That is what brothers do, Sergeant Major. We do not let each other disappear. From across the plaza, Sarah called out, Dad, we are ready whenever you are. Vernon turned toward his daughter's voices, toward the future he had not believed he deserved. Behind him stood a general who had waited 45 years to say thank you. Before him stood the family he had abandoned and who had never stopped hoping for his return. One day at a time, he reminded himself, one conversation at a time. He straightened his worn coat, tucked the challenge coin into his pocket beside Eleanor's ring, and walked toward his daughters. For the first time in 6 years, he was walking towards something instead of away. The drive to the church took less than 10 minutes, but Vernon spent every second of it relearning the sensation of being inside a vehicle. Sarah drove, while Rebecca sat in the back with him, her hand resting on his arm as if physical contact was the only way to confirm he was real. The car was warm, the seats were soft, and the radio played something quiet that Vernon did not recognize. He stared out the window at a town he had watched from the edges for years. The storefronts he had passed on early morning walks. The diner where he had occasionally allowed himself coffee when he had scrounged enough change. The library where he had spent winter afternoons reading in the corner, invisible among the shelves. He had been a ghost in this place. Now he was something else, something he did not yet have a name for. Pastor Whitfield was waiting for them outside the church, a modest white building with a steeple that had seen better decades. He stood on the front steps with his hands in his pockets, patient and unhurried, as if he had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. Which, Vernon supposed, he had been. "The room is ready," Whitfield said as they approached. "Nothing fancy. Bed, desk, bathroom down the hall. But it is warm, and it is yours for as long as you need it." Vernon looked up at the building. The cross on the steeple caught the afternoon light. He was not a religious man, had not been since Vietnam took whatever faith he had carried into the jungle. But there was something in Whitfield's steady presence that felt like grace anyway. "Thank you," Vernon said, "for not giving up." Whitfield smiled. "That is the job, Sergeant Major. We do not give up on our people." Inside, the church smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the particular mustiness of buildings that had stood for a century. Whitfield led them down a narrow hallway past Sunday school classrooms and a fellowship hall until they reached a door at the back. The room was small but clean. A single bed with a quilt that someone's grandmother had probably made. A wooden desk with a lamp. A window that looked out on a small garden, dormant now in November, but showing the bones of what would bloom in spring. On the desk sat a Bible, a notebook, and a pen. "The bathroom is 2 doors down," Whitfield said. "Towels are in the closet. There is a kitchen through the fellowship hall where you can help yourself to anything." He paused in the doorway. "Breakfast is at 7 if you want company. But no pressure. This is your space, your pace." Vernon walked to the window and looked out at the garden. Somewhere out there, past the edge of town, his camp still sat in the woods. His tarp and his fire pit and his carefully organized life of solitude. Part of him ached for it. The simplicity, the silence, the absence of expectation. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant for 6 years, felt something else. Relief. The exhaustion of a man who had been running for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stop. Sarah appeared beside him. She did not speak, just stood close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Rebecca joined them on his other side. 3 people standing at a window, looking out at a garden that would bloom again when winter ended. "We should let you rest," Sarah said finally. "It had been a long day." Vernon nodded. The longest day he could remember, and somehow also the shortest. Time had done strange things since the moment that rifle jammed. Rebecca pulled a piece of paper from her pocket and pressed it into his hand. "Our phone numbers," she said. "Both of us. Call any time, day or night, even if you just want to hear a voice." Vernon looked at the paper. 2 numbers written in careful handwriting. Such a small thing. Such an enormous thing. "I do not have a phone," he admitted. Sarah was already reaching into her purse. She pulled out a simple flip phone, the kind they sold at gas stations for $20. "I grabbed this while you were talking to the general," she said. "It is prepaid. Nothing fancy, but it works." She pressed it into his other hand. "Our numbers are already programmed in." Vernon stood holding a phone in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. 2 lifelines. 2 connections to a world he had disconnected from. His throat tightened. "You did not have to do this," he managed. Rebecca shook her head. "Yes, we did." She leaned in and kissed his cheek, her lips warm against his weathered skin. "We'll be back tomorrow. Early. With breakfast. And you're going to eat it." Sarah hugged him, holding on longer than she probably intended. "I love you, Dad," she whispered. "I never stopped. Even when I was angry. Even when I thought you were dead. I never stopped loving you." Vernon hugged her back, his arms remembering how to hold the daughter he had carried as a baby, pushed on swings as a child, walked down the aisle at her wedding. "I love you too," he said. "Both of you. I am sorry it took me so long to say it." They left slowly, looking back at him from the doorway, from the hallway, from the front steps of the church. Vernon watched from his window as they got into the car, as Sarah started the engine, as they pulled away with one final wave. Then they were gone, and he was alone. But it was a different kind of alone than he had known in the woods. This alone had walls and a roof and a quilt on the bed. This alone had a phone in his pocket and phone numbers written on paper. This alone had a door he could open whenever he chose. Pastor Whitfield knocked softly a few minutes later. "Vernon, there is someone here who would like to see you." Only if you're up for it. Vernon turned from the window. He was exhausted beyond measure, wrung out by emotion and revelation and the sheer weight of human connection. But something in Whitfield's tone made him nod. The pastor stepped aside, and Private First Class Amy Chun walked into the room. She had changed out of her dress uniform into civilian clothes, jeans, and a sweater that made her look even younger than she had at the ceremony. Her eyes were uncertain but determined, the eyes of someone who had something to say and was not leaving until she said it. "Sergeant Major," she began, then stopped, swallowed, started again. "I wanted to thank you, not just for fixing the rifle, for standing up for me when Captain Simmons was yelling. Nobody has ever done that before." Vernon studied her. This young woman who had been publicly humiliated and had somehow emerged from it with her dignity intact. "You did nothing wrong," he said. "The failure was not yours. I know that now." She paused, gathering courage. "But I also wanted to ask you something." She took a breath. "I am thinking about going active duty, leaving the reserves, actually committing to this. But after today, after everything Captain Simmons said, I was not sure if I belonged." Vernon was quiet for a moment. He remembered that doubt. The early days when he had wondered if he was cut out for the life he had chosen. The instructors who had broken him down and built him back up. The brothers who had shown him what belonging really meant. "Private Chun," he said slowly, "the military needs people like you. People who show up. People who endure. People who do not break when small men try to tear them down." He met her eyes. "Captain Simmons does not represent what service is supposed to be. Do not let one fool in a uniform convince you that you do not belong." She nodded, blinking back tears. "Would you be willing to write me a recommendation for my application? I know you do not know me, but coming from someone like you, it would mean everything." Vernon almost laughed. Someone like him. A homeless man in borrowed clothes, standing in a church room with nothing to his name but a phone and a challenge coin and a wedding ring on a chain. But he was also Master Gunnery Sergeant Vernon Cobb, call sign Whisper, the man who had trained an entire generation of warriors. "I will be honored," he said. Private Chin's face broke into a smile that made her look even younger. "Thank you, Sergeant Major. Thank you so much." After she left, Vernon sat on the edge of the bed. The quilt was soft under his hands. The room was warm. Outside, the November light was fading toward evening. On the desk, beside the Bible and the notebook, sat the leather journal Margaret Holloway had given him. Her son's words. A young Marine's admiration preserved in pages that had survived when the Marine himself had not. Vernon was not ready to read it. Not yet. But he set it carefully on the nightstand beside the bed, where he could see it, where it could remind him of why he had taught and trained and shaped young warriors for so long. He lay back on the bed, still in his worn coat, still in his taped boots. The ceiling above him was white and clean and unremarkable, but it was a ceiling, a roof, a shelter he had not sought but had somehow found anyway. Vernon closed his eyes, and for the first time in 6 years, he did not dream of the dead. He dreamed of gardens blooming in spring and daughters laughing, and a voice he knew better than his own whispering that she was proud of him. Eleanor's voice, telling him he had finally come home. 3 months later, the garden outside Vernon's window had begun to show the first signs of spring. Crocuses pushed through the thawing earth, purple and white and yellow, determined to bloom despite the lingering cold. Vernon watched them from his desk each morning, marveling at their persistence, at their refusal to stay buried. He had learned something about persistence in these 3 months, about the slow and painful work of returning to the world. There had been difficult days, days when the walls of the room felt like a prison and the woods called to him with their promise of solitude and silence. Days when the nightmares returned with such force that he woke gasping, reaching for a rifle that was not there, scanning for threats that existed only in memory. But there had been other days, too. Days when Sarah brought her children to meet him, and he learned that he was a grandfather twice over. Days when Rebecca sat with him for hours, filling in the gaps of the years he had missed, showing him photographs on her phone of graduations and weddings and ordinary moments that meant everything. Days when Pastor Whitfield simply sat with him in silence, asking nothing, offering presents. The video from Veterans Day had gone viral, as these things do. Millions of views. News interviews requested and declined. A country briefly captivated by the story of a homeless veteran and a jammed rifle and a revelation that had brought strangers to tears. Vernon had refused all media attention. He had not endured 6 years in the wilderness to become a spectacle. But something good had come from the attention. Donations had poured into Pastor Whitfield's Veterans Program, enough to expand the shelter, to hire counselors, to create a proper reintegration system for men and women who had fallen through the cracks. Vernon's face had become the face of a cause, even though he never appeared on camera. His story had opened wallets and hearts in equal measure. Captain Bradley Simmons had resigned his commission 2 weeks after Veterans Day. The video of his behavior had made his position untenable. Vernon had heard that he was working in insurance now, far from anything military, carrying the weight of a mistake that would follow him forever. Vernon did not feel satisfaction at this news, only a tired kind of pity for a man who had never learned the difference between authority and leadership. Private Shun had received her acceptance to active duty in January. She had called Vernon to tell him, her voice bright with excitement and nerves. He had written her recommendation as promised, 3 pages that detailed not what he knew of her service record, but what he had witnessed of her character. The way she had endured public humiliation without breaking. The way she had spoken up when it would have been easier to stay silent. The way she had come to thank him when she owed him nothing. She would make a fine Marine. He was certain of it. The leather journal from Margaret Holloway sat on Vernon's desk, worn soft from handling. He had finally read it, 1 entry at a time, spread across weeks of careful attention. David Holloway's words had reached across the years, across the grave, to teach Vernon something he had been too blind to see. The young Marine had written about fear and courage, about doubt and determination, about the weight of carrying a rifle that could end lives or save them. But mostly he had written about the instructors who had shaped him, about a man called Whisper who spoke softly but carried the weight of worlds, about lessons learned in classrooms and firing ranges that had nothing to do with bullets and everything to do with honor. One passage had broken Vernon completely. He had read it so many times he could recite it from memory. Whisper told us today that the hardest part of being a warrior is not the fighting. It is the living. It is coming home and looking at the people you love and wondering if you deserve them. He said the answer is always yes. He said we earn that love not through what we do in combat, but through what we do after. Through the choice to keep trying, even when everything in us wants to give up. Vernon had wept when he read those words. His own words, reflected back through the pen of a young man who had heard them and remembered them and carried them into battle and beyond. He had taught that lesson to hundreds of Marines over the years. He had just never believed it applied to him. But he was learning, slowly, painfully, one day at a time. He was learning to believe that he deserved the love his daughters offered so freely, that he had earned the right to rest. That survival was not betrayal, but continuation. On this March morning, Vernon rose early and dressed in clothes that Sarah had brought him. Clean jeans, a flannel shirt that fit properly, boots that did not require tape to stay together. He looked in a mirror and saw a man he was still learning to recognize. Older than he remembered, weathered by years and grief, but present, alive, still here. He walked to the church's fellowship hall, where the weekly veterans group was already gathering. 12 men and 3 women, all carrying their own invisible wounds, all working through their own slow recoveries. Vernon had started attending these meetings in December, sitting in the back, listening without speaking. It had taken him 6 weeks to say his first words to the group. My name is Vernon. Call sign was Whisper, and I lost myself for a while. That was all he had managed that first time, but it had been enough. The others had nodded, understanding without needing explanation. They were all learning the same lesson. That asking for help was not weakness. That community was not a burden. That the hardest battle was often the one fought in silence, alone, against an enemy that wore your own face. Today, Vernon took his seat in the circle and waited for the meeting to begin. Pastor Whitfield opened with his usual words about courage and patience and the long road home. Then he turned to Vernon. "Vernon," he said, "would you like to share today?" Vernon looked around the circle, at the faces of men and women who had seen things that could not be unseen, who had done things that could not be undone, who were trying, like him, to find their way back to a world that did not always make room for people like them. He thought about Eleanor, about the promise he had made at her grave so many months ago, about the daughters who called him every day, about the grandchildren who were learning to call him Grandpa, about Private Chun, who had texted him last week to say that boot camp was hard, but she was not giving up. He thought about Billy Hartwell bleeding out in the elephant grass, about David Holloway throwing himself on a grenade to save his squad, about all the names written in the journal he still carried, all the faces that visited him in the night. "Yes," Vernon said, "I would like to share." He took a breath. The room waited. "I spent 6 years believing I did not deserve to be here," he began, "believing that surviving was a sin I had to pay for. I pushed away everyone who loved me because I thought my pain would infect them. I lived in the woods like an animal because I thought that was all I was worth." He paused, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "But I was wrong. Surviving is not betraying the dead. It is honoring them. Every day we keep going. Every day we choose to stay and fight. We carry them with us. We become the proof that their sacrifice meant something." Vernon looked around the circle again, at eyes that glistened, at hands that gripped armrests, at hearts that understood. "I'm not healed," he said. "I do not know if I ever will be. But I am here. I'm trying. And for the first time in a long time, I believe that is enough." The room was silent for a moment. Then the woman across from him, a Navy corpsman who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, nodded slowly. "That is enough," she said. "More than enough." After the meeting, Vernon walked to the cemetery. The March wind was cold, but carried the promise of warmth to come. He found Eleanor's grave and lowered himself to the ground beside her, the way he had done every week for 3 months. "Morning, Ellie," he said. "The flowers are starting to bloom. You would love them." He sat with her for an hour, talking about the grandchildren and the veterans group and the small victories of ordinary days. He told her about the letter he had received from General Reese, about the invitation to speak at Quantico that he was considering accepting, about the fear that still gripped him sometimes, and the courage that was slowly learning to answer it. When he finally rose to leave, he pressed his palm against the cold stone one last time. "Still here, Ellie," he whispered, "still trying. And I think, finally, I am finding my way home." He walked back toward the church, toward the room that had become his sanctuary, toward the life he was slowly rebuilding from the wreckage of the one he had abandoned. The crocuses bloomed along the path, purple and white and yellow, pushing through the cold earth toward the sun. Vernon walked among them, a man who had been buried and was learning to bloom again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected forms, please subscribe to our channel. And share in the comments who the quiet hero in your life is. The person who serves without recognition, who carries weight without complaint, who keeps trying even when everything seems lost. Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones in uniform. Sometimes they are the ones we pass on the street without a second glance. Thank you for watching. And remember, it is never too late to come home.